Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of The Big Breakfast. Morning, Rob.
Good morning.
Right, let's get straight into today. I think it's going to be a fairly long session, so hopefully we can get through it and finish on time. Today's session is around challenging outcomes, and that's specifically outcomes from a procurement process. We've had quite a number of discussions over the last year around this particular issue in multiple sectors across multiple bodies, and there's some lessons that I think are useful just to, or even just reflections that are useful to go back through. So if we get stuck into it,
let's go for it.
I think the first thing, which is always difficult to do, is just to take the emotion out of the process and try and be as objective as possible, despite how bad or angry you feel and want to do damage to the person who has sent the letter informing you that your bid was rubbish or your proposal was terrible and these are the reasons why. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I mean, because I have no emotions at all. How difficult this is in terms of being able to actually do this point.
Well, I'm fairly laid back, so it's not too much of a struggle. It's very difficult though to look at words. It's like when you read an email and you take it out of context. If you're not careful, you can read it in completely the wrong way and you start getting really frustrated. So not just that. Take the emotion out of the process. Read it once. Feel free to get emotional. Go away. Come back. Read it a second or third time. Very clearly. And once you've maybe got your outburst out of the way.
And I think that's a useful distinction to make. Is actually the emotion needs to be out of the process of what's about to follow. But I think it's very difficult not to swear a lot when you first read the feedback if it's not what you want to see and you don't think it's in line with your own evaluation. In fact, I think we should compile some of the best quotes that we've heard into that initial outburst and perhaps publish those for a bit of a laugh.
I don't think they're publishable, to be honest.
No, perhaps not. Okay, so let's assume that we've gone through all the swearing and chucking stuff at walls and threatening death on people and all that sort of stuff in the nicest possible way, of course. I think the next thing then is once everyone's calmed down, is to actually get into this process, which is then to look at the feedback. I would suggest, if there are enough people in the organisation, to do this independently and then bring those reviewers together and discuss the findings. So it's almost mirroring a procurement process in terms of independent evaluation and moderation, because I think we've seen over the years that perhaps we have different takes on things, and where one thing might be a big deal for somebody, it's actually with a bit of discussion it isn't, and that there's either a better argument to make or no argument, or again, as you said, probably taken out of context. So I think this is probably the most useful thing in terms of setting the foundations for understanding whether there is anything there or not.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's very useful to have different people reviewing it of maybe different skills and mindsets as well. We have very different mindsets, so that helps. There's no point having a couple of people have a look at it who are almost certainly going to agree with one another. Unless it's that obvious that agreement's not a problem, but you've got to have differing views to make it worthwhile.
Yeah. Okay. And I mean, the other thing that people may want to think about is whether they get somebody who's completely independent of the process to review it, that has no attachment. That's sometimes good, it's sometimes not, because you've got to brief them in and then they've got to kind of understand what the process is, and sometimes that's just more hassle than it's worth. But that's potentially one thing to consider outside of the team, and that might be someone within the organisation, it might be someone completely independent, but just something to have a think about. So the next sort of set of things that we would suggest that you go through is to, when you've actually made your assessment, is prioritise the factual inaccuracies, which is very much linked to that second point, which is understand that subjective opinion-based points are harder to argue. So we've seen a lot over the last year, at least, where the feedback has been this response could have been strengthened or scored more points if this was included, or you omitted to mention XYZ. Those points are there. So that is just factual inaccuracy, or they've said something in the feedback that's factually incorrect. That's essentially black and white. And I think for both of us, they're very easy to pick up on when you reread things, and those are the ones that almost don't need an argument when it goes back to the people that scored it. It's this second point, point number 4 here, where it's he said, she said, which is very, very difficult. And then this kind of links into that 5th point, which is it's probably subjective because the evaluation criteria or the question was ambiguous. And I know we've talked about this a lot, particularly over the last probably 3, 4, 5 months in different bids, where you look at the criteria and you think, well, what do they actually mean by that? And of course, there's the whole clarification process to go through. And sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. Sometimes it's helpful, and other times there's an absolute wall that you can't get past. So once you've kind of got that list of things that you potentially think aren't right, this is what we would suggest in terms of how you prioritize them. So factual stuff first, then the subjective opinion-based points next. But most importantly, is that feedback in line with the evaluation criteria? Because that's what's generated the score in the first place. And secondly, is it relevant to the question? And again, we've seen this in recent times where the feedback they've given does not relate to the question.
Yeah, I think that's a relatively easy argument to make when the feedback obviously doesn't relate to the question. I think it's potentially difficult where you have quite a short, ambiguous question where clarification questions maybe didn't help, or you thought that the question made perfect sense and you thought you'd actually covered everything off, but you haven't gone above and beyond maybe in the evaluator's eyes, or the evaluator has read the question in a different way to what you have. That's really difficult. That's where you get into the subjective elements. As Matt's saying, it's those factual inaccuracies. For example, they've said, you have not put examples of X in there. Well, you put 5 examples of X in there. That's very easy to challenge. But where it's a case of, oh, well, you could have included this. Well, maybe the question didn't explicitly ask for it, but potentially there's probably a linkage there. That's really difficult to challenge. The easiest ones to challenge are the factual inaccuracies. And those, I suppose, those clearer questions where it's, we want you to include X, Y, Z. And if you've done that and they've said you haven't, that's really easy to challenge. But it really does come down a lot to that evaluation criteria and the question itself.
And just as you were talking, Rob, it made me think some of the groans that we've had when we see a massive question that then has 10 bullet points to answer. And sometimes actually that's easier because it's very clear what you need to cover, as opposed to the 1-sentence question, which is tell us about this. And as you've said, it's how you interpret that question, which is very difficult then to argue. And I think it just depends on the person's experience that reads the response in terms of what they expect to see. So if someone's had, one set of experiences of whether the service or the model or whatever you describe it, they might think, oh, well, I would expect to see this, that, and the other based on my experience, whereas somebody else will expect to see something completely different.
Just to go slightly to the side a little bit here, I've been thinking about this. Is those short, ambiguous questions, I think it's really bad commissioning, frankly. Because what is the point of the process? The point of the process is to get the best provider. Well, to get the best provider, ask the right questions that are very clear. We want to see how you do X, Y, Z. Not, how do you feel about whatever this is, or how might you do this? I don't think that's very good value for money for the public, to be honest. because you could get all sorts of weird and wonderful things. It should be, how are you going to do this specific thing?
Yeah, and I think, that's probably a result of lack of time, too many things to procure, disconnect. And that's probably a whole different session, isn't it, around why the questions aren't
But it almost
drafted.
feels like you're trying to catch somebody out with that.
Well, yeah, I think. Yeah.
And I don't really understand the point of that. I'm probably making too much of a leap there. That's probably not that malicious. But sometimes it feels like it, and it shouldn't be like a trick question. And with all the clarification questions you ask in the world, you can still get caught out, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that's not how the game should be working.
No. And that's, we often say this, but that word game, I mean, it's essentially a game. This process where you have to score points to win, and I think this is the bit where it's understanding what the rules are, playing to the rules, and essentially everything that's written should be with a view to score a point. And I mean, the amount of discussions we've had with teams over the years around, it's beautifully written and it's great to hear about all this stuff, but none of it is going to score a point, so it needs to go in the bin. But for this particular bid, might be great for marketing material, it might be great for other stuff, but in terms of scoring points to win the game, it's not going to cut it. So I think, again, this subjective thing is so difficult to get a conclusion that's agreeable to both sides, because it will simply be, well, we thought it was this, and this was the intention we asked it with, and you didn't understand that, and you've said this, and therefore, you haven't scored it. The other thing that's interesting here, and I know we've picked this up recently, was whether people that score responses have stuck to the criteria in isolation and said, your bid ticks these boxes in the criteria, or whether they then say, well, actually, the last bid I read had this, that, and the other in, and yours doesn't. And I think you came up with the term comparative scoring. And I think that's a really interesting point of whether we know that happens. And it's very difficult to guard against that, because if the same person's reading 10 bids, they're obviously got that knowledge in their head.
So who gets the advantage, the first one or the last one?
Yeah, exactly. So again, it's, we can sit here and criticize. It's difficult at the other end, I think, to be able to do this independently.
It is, but the other thing is that it's public money, mostly. I mean, 90% of the work we're involved in is public money, so it should be the right decisions and the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to the next chunk of actions then. So compile a list of the points you want to challenge, and it might be that you start off with 50 points, and after you have gone through that moderation process, there might be 10 that are actually reasonable points to challenge on. And those discussions in that moderation really need to be challenging. And you can challenge each other, but they've got to stack up outside of your organisation. So, part of this, it'll get back to that emotional input again of, we had 4 weeks to write the bid, the clarification questions weren't helpful. There's all sorts of stuff going on where, as a bidder, you kind of feel a little bit on the back foot, because, as we all know, timelines can slip at the other end, but not our end. We're pushed into things we don't want to do. There's tight financial budgets to work to, and it does feel a little bit one-sided sometimes. But what we can't do is say, well, it wasn't the best process and all these other things that kind of, it was Christmas and someone was off sick. That's irrelevant. We've got to get back to what is factually correct or not correct, so that it will stand up to a robust challenge. The next thing then, and this, Rob, we talked about this when we put the slides together, I think this is a really great point that you'd come up with, was assess whether your challenge will change the outcome. So do you just want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think if you can easily understand the feedback and the scoring, and if for example, the scoring has said, you have not included this, so you have scored 4 out of 5, but you have included it, that may have changed it to a 5. So you've got to work out if those factual inaccuracies that you've picked up on and that rationale could bump up your score. And would it bump up your score to be level or above the winning bidder? If you don't think it will, or there's no chance of it, then the challenge is irrelevant. you can feel hard done by, and you may want to make points on a point of principle, but it's probably not worth the effort to be going through with.
And I think that is a really interesting dilemma for people. And we have had it, and just as you were talking it, I had flashbacks of times when we've been through this exact process where it either will or won't change the outcome. Mostly what I was thinking of, where it won't change the outcome, but bidders want to, I was going to say try and help, that's probably being a bit generous, but try to help the procurement teams to improve their process. Because this has to be a two-way thing. Where we don't want to be is procurement teams and bidders butting heads all the time, because that doesn't get the best outcome. That doesn't get you the best value for public money. That doesn't get you the best service. And it's difficult with this because, again, it's written word on a page, which is really cold, as opposed to a sales conversation where you're in a room and you can say, well, actually, what did you mean by that? And just tell me a bit more about this. So I think with this, there's clearly an improvement cycle for bidders. Is there an improvement cycle for procurement teams and commissioners? The answer is yes, there is.
There is, but it doesn't usually take into account our side or our client's side, which
and I think exactly, yeah, and that's the point that we've discussed a lot of. Even though this is not going to change whether we win or lose, should we just put these points in as a please feed these into your improvement cycle? And that's a question that needs to be answered by the bidder of, are we bothered? Can we spend the time on this, or are we straight on to the next bid, or do we actually want to help or not? And again, that's probably quite emotionally driven at this point. And then we're on the next point, which is agree at board or senior level whether you want to challenge or make any representations. And this is a difficult discussion to have, and there's pros and cons. Obviously, the best upside is that the original scoring's changed and that you have won. The downside is then all of the political fallout. People get very worried about challenging decisions, that it will negatively impact them in the future. And there's, I think, that potentially that's always going to happen, but there are several organisations that I can think of over the years that have challenged decisions and have won the challenge, have either been financially compensated or contracts have been re-awarded, or well, they weren't awarded in the first place. So the preferred bidder has changed within the standstill period. And actually, whilst there was a bit of media coverage for a month or two, maybe, that's gone away quite quickly after that, and it hasn't necessarily had a negative impact. There'll always be long-term memories of certain people who think, oh, well, they challenged this, and do we want them? My view on this is that this process is there for this very reason, where things aren't correct. So this isn't we've spat a dummy out and we want to challenge something that is indefensible. This is a process that's set in stone, that's there for when people make mistakes. And there's people on both sides, and clearly the amount of procurements every year, people will make mistakes, and this is the process to do it, and it has to be done the right way. Anything you want to come in with that, Rob?
I can't add to that, to be honest. That's pretty much spot on.
All right. So let's get on to the final three then. Alongside the challenges you want to make, I think it's always a good idea just to draft a letter, just summarising, first of all, your approach and what you've done. So some of the things there, you might want to say some of the things like we've had several people look at it, potentially someone independent. You've just then got to be careful of confidentiality and who's seen it. But then most importantly, what you want to happen next. So do you want your bid to be rescored? Is it simply, here's some information for learning? Is it that your lawyers are about to get involved? Is it that you want them to extend standstill? But what do you want to happen? And be very clear about that. Rob, is there anything you want to say on drafting letters?
Well, I was just going to say, internally, you also need to work out how far are you prepared to take this as well. That's another point, and the potential implications of that. It's not just your time which may be better spent elsewhere, depending on the importance of this contract. There's potentially money if you go down the legal route as well. So that's just something you've got to consider. With the supporting letter, just make it very clear, non-emotive. Definitely non-emotive every time. You've got to be clear, professional. Don't ramble or waffle on, which is very easy to do in these situations. Potentially have a table of the things you want to challenge as well. Make it very clear what question your challenges relate to. Cross-reference the evaluation feedback versus what you think is the inaccuracy as well. Whatever you do, just make it very simple, make it very clear.
And I think that point around how far do you want to go needs to happen at board level. That's the exact conversation that needs to happen. Is if we do challenge this, do we want to commit 50 grand to a legal case or whatever that might be, whatever it is, whether it's time, money, other resource, how far do we want to go? Because, there's potentially an option where, you receive communication back to say, well, actually, we don't agree with any of this. And you know it's factually inaccurate. So then do you just accept it? And we've seen this. We saw this in a framework bid 2 or 3 years ago, where we'd gone back and said, you said this hasn't been included. Here it is. And they just came back and said, well, our decision's our decision, tough. Which basically then, and I don't want to name the procurement body, but the question was then, well, it's clearly wrong and they're not going to budge on this. So what's next? Do we take this, do we get the lawyers involved? And then it's into that discussion again of, well, do we want to be seen as a bidder that challenges? Well, I think in this case, you do, because it's just wrong. And there's been no reasonable assessment of the feedback that the bidder's given. So you've really got to test how far you want to go. Of if they come back and say no, and it's factual issues, are you going to push? And if you're not, there's no point doing it in the first place.
It's a really tricky one, isn't it? Because I think, and it doesn't happen very often, where you see multiple factual inaccuracies in evaluation. You might pick up on one or two, okay? But we've seen at times where it has been multiple times, and you begin to wonder, and it's very difficult not to. The emotion starts to come in of how and why has this occurred? Is this they've had too many to read? They're tired. Is it, dare I say, incompetence, or is it something even more slightly sinister, playing with politics or whatever? It's a very tricky one. I think there is a bit of a duty on bidders to tell procurement, commissioning bodies, procurement, whatever, where there are clear inaccuracies. As you say, going back to those continuous improvement cycles, because it shouldn't be allowed to happen. I know with the new Procurement Act there is almost like an appeals board. Can't remember what it's called off the top of my head now, because we've never had to advise anyone to go near it. But there is a way of feeding that back, and there is a way of challenging through that. And I think if you have an instance, even where it may not, affect the outcome of the bid, where you have multiple factual inaccuracies, it's worth noting down and escalating that.
And this is interesting because we've got to the same point that we always get to with these discussions, which is actually there is some learning here. So do we have a duty to go back and say, we accept this won't change the outcome, but these are things that we think could have been better? This is exactly where we get to every time, Rob. Fine. Okay. So I think the point there is, if you are going to draft this letter, make sure that you know exactly how far you're going to go and again what you want to happen. So is it that the letter's going to come from your lawyers? Is it that you're going to openly copy your lawyers into the letter? Is it that you are just sending this to the procurement team and the commissioning body? The ideal world for me here is that you resolve this through this particular process without having a long, costly legal battle, because that doesn't help anybody, particularly if it's going to take months to sort out, that impacts on mobilization, that impacts on the service or the product then that's got to be delivered at the end. Ideal situation, you send this back, it's very to the point and factual. They read it and say, yeah, okay, we're going to rescore this and we're going to see where it gets to. And then everyone's, in theory, happy at the end of the process. The other thing here, and this actually happened a few years ago to one of our clients. They did, and this wasn't a challenge, but this was in relation to something else. They submitted their bid, was successful, then just assumed everything would be fine after that, didn't monitor to the portal, missed a key bit of communication, which then meant they couldn't then carry on with the framework. So if you are going to put, yeah, I know. If you are going to put in a challenge, make sure that you monitor the portal or your email or whatever that communication channel is. Because if they come back and say, thanks for the letter, accept these points, can we now have a meeting, or can you submit this further evidence by, and normally it's time limited. So can you submit further evidence by 17th or whatever, and you don't see that, and then you see it on the 18th and go, oh, brilliant, yeah, we've got this, and now we're going to submit the following to make sure this gets, overturned or whatever it might be, and they turn around and say, well, we've given you a week and you've missed it. That is the worst possible outcome of all of this, is that somebody doesn't monitor the portal or comms channel. I don't think there's much more to say on that, is there, Rob?
Pretty clear.
And I think, this final point, we've talked about improvement cycles. Certainly from a bid side, that should always be an improvement cycle. And I think there definitely are improvement cycles at the other end. And it's how we feed into those in a way that's constructive. But I think regardless of what happens with this challenge, it should always inform bidders' improvement cycles. And whether that's just general feedback, if you didn't mention this point, or this was misinterpreted, or your finance model was hard to understand, whatever it might be, regardless of whether you've won or lost, it should always go into your improvement cycle. But there's probably points from the challenge process that could also go into your improvement cycle as well. Fine. Well, I think we've pretty much used up all the time on that, Rob. So should we move on to some of the opportunities that we have pulled out for this week? Do you want to run through these?
Oh, yeah. Which TPAS, isn't it?
Yeah,
TPAS,
that's right. Yeah.
Number one. You do. That's the one you picked up on. So
yeah. So TPAS has been out there for a lot of times. I think we're on TPAS 3 now, and it's a very large framework. I can read off the screen, but essentially the key things here are the value of this one. So there's a lot of business that goes through that. There's 24 billion pounds worth of business going through it. There's a reasonable amount of time, so July 27 to July 31 with a possible extension. That is currently market engagement stage. The first event was last year, and that's still working through. There was a notice this week, just updating people on what's going on. This is definitely one to watch if you've got anything in relation to tech products or associated services. There's plenty of time to start to develop an approach to this. So this is essentially a heads up, or have a look at it and get prepared.
Yeah. I think the bigger point on that is TPAS is one of those giant frameworks that if you're on it, it just gives you a brilliant opportunity to sell into the public sector. It doesn't mean if you're not on it, you can't, because there are other frameworks out there, but this is the biggest one. So if you're in that sector, you sell those products, keep that in mind. This next one, this is an example of because TPAS is a Crown Commercial Service as well. I can't remember if they've rebranded or are rebranding, but it's the biggest one. The next one is NEPO, which is Northeast Procurement Organisation, I think. But their frameworks are available to use across the entire country by local authorities, other public sector organisations. This has got 200 million on it. This is currently live. Grounds maintenance equipment plant. Again, another really good framework if you're in those sectors, particularly maybe if your normal routes to market might be slightly down at the moment. Public sector is at least reliable to a certain extent. And the same with the last one on construction. There's a lot in this particular framework. It is worth looking at. 24 billion over 10 years. There's a lot of money in there. Design, establish, it's everything construction related. So have a look at that. I won't waffle on because we've got 3 seconds left.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with that one was the social value was worth 20% instead of the usual 10.
Which it often is with construction, actually, because there's a lot of social value you can do with construction-related projects.
And this one was a big focus on managing the frameworks and markets within that one. Okay, we are pretty much at time. We were going to quickly touch on renewables. It looks like there's a load of other stuff coming up in that, just out of the news. It's worth just having a look at that if you're in that market. But as we are pretty much bang on time, thank you for joining us again. We will be back in 2 weeks on the 25th of February, and we will both see you then.
Cheers.